Hello everyone. Today we will be doing a different kind of video. With me, I have my friend Amos Wollen. Amos, would you please be willing to give us a brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, I'm about to be second year undergrad in philosophy and theology. I don't know, I write papers sometimes. I have a blog called Going AWOL on Substack. And I'm about to start a YouTube channel about applied ethics and public policy. So keep tuned for that.
For sure. I hope that goes well for you.
Cheers.
So today we'll be doing a video on a new way to oppose abortion. It is a paper that Amos wrote a couple months ago. Maybe it's published on Springer. It will be linked below. And Amos is actually pro-choice, even though he proposed an argument against abortion. What's that about, Amos?
What's that about? Okay, so I think the abortion debate will ultimately come down to competing theories of personal identity. So pro-lifers will have to hold on to a view on which I was once a zygote, and the range of views in personal identity that will allow you to say that are probably just restricted to animalism, the view that you're an animal, and certain kinds of hylomorphism, which say you're a compound of matter and form, and the essential part of you is the form. It's not really a part, but whatever. Uh, and then on the other hand, I hold a view of personal identity on which I'm essentially a mind. Specifically, I think I'm a soul, but you could also think that you're a brain or a certain part of your brain, or your brain plus another part of the rest of your body. And so that part of you, the mind, the part with a direct capacity for consciousness, that only comes to exist later on in pregnancy. So um, I'm not pro-choice up until birth, but I'm not pro-life down to conception.
Amazing. So it's sort of like a substance dualist view,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So for any one of you who's watching and is pro-choice, don't worry. This might not be able to convert you, as it did not convert Amos, but it sure will give you something to think about, at least, in my opinion. So would you like to start us with this?
Yeah, so I'll just preface this. It's not an argument against abortion that could convince everyone. It's specifically a way to respond to a famous type of pro-choice argument, which grants, for the sake of argument, that the fetus is a person with a right to life, the same right to life that you and I have, but then says, even if you grant that, abortion should still be legal or is permissible. So this argument started with Judith Jarvis Thompson, and its most prominent defender today is David Boonin. And the style of the argument is basically to say, okay, even if the fetus is a person with a right to life, that doesn't imply that the mother is obligated to gestate the fetus for 9 months. Just as you're not obligated to stay hooked up to a violinist who needs your organs to survive for 9 months, just because it needs them. And so the pro-choicer who advances this argument can say you can unplug from the fetus in the same way that you could unplug from the violinist who needs your organs to survive for 9 months. Um, and so I want to advance a new way for pro-lifers to respond to this kind of argument. I don't think it's entirely convincing. So yeah. So like I said, this type of argument says that abortion should be legal even if the fetus is a person. This is the cover of a book by David Boonin called Beyond Roe. It's my favorite book on abortion. It's so deliciously written. It's so scrummy and delicious. Uh, and yeah, so if you want to have a look at the kind of argument that I'm responding to from the perspective of someone who endorses it, you should absolutely pick up this book, Beyond Roe: Why Abortion Should Be Legal Even if the Fetus is a Person.
I will have that book linked down below, just for everyone watching.
Perfect. Um, so the argument of the book starts off with an analogy. It's a real life case. So it's a case of a guy in the late 1970s called Robert McFall, who is an asbestos worker in Pittsburgh, and he developed a plastic anemia. And the doctors told him he would die unless he had a bone marrow transplant from someone whose bone marrow was compatible with his body. And so um, the dogs were looking and they couldn't find anyone. And then, it turned out that someone who might be compatible was his cousin, David Shimp. And so initially, Shimp submitted to testing, but then halfway through the testing process, he withdrew and he said, no, I don't consent to the testing. I don't want to give my bone marrow to my cousin, even though he needs it to live. And so he withdrew from the process. And without that bone marrow transplant, McFall knew he would die. So he took his cousin to court, and he tried to get the judge to force his cousin to give him his bone marrow. And the judge essentially said, like, whoa, what your cousin is doing is really wrong. But the state still can't force you or anyone to give anyone else part of their body, like their bone marrow, even if someone else needs it to live. And so the argument takes this general principle and says, okay, if the state can't force you to donate your bone marrow to someone else who needs you to live, then equally it can't force a woman to gestate somebody for 9 months just because that somebody needs her body to live. And so this generates an argument for abortion, which essentially says that the woman should be allowed to stop being pregnant because the state can't force her to continue to gestate the fetus, even if morally she should. And so probably the most forceful response to this kind of pro-choice argument is the killing versus letting die objection. The killing versus letting die objection says, in the case of McFall and Shimp, what Shimp does is merely allow McFall to die by not giving him a part of his body. But in the case of abortion, what happens is the fetus is actively killed. And so that creates a morally relevant disanalogy. You might imagine that if David Shimp had consented initially to give his bone marrow to McFall, and he'd hooked himself up to a bone marrow transfer machine, and it was sort of pumping his bone marrow across, and then midway through the process he decided, you know what, I regret this decision, I want to pull out. But the only way for him to disconnect was to actively kill his cousin, say by just sawing him in half, that would be impermissible. He's not obligated to give him his bone marrow, but he's not allowed to kill his cousin in the process of detaching him. And so the objection goes, that's just what abortion does. It actively kills the fetus in the process of detaching it. And what David Boonin says in response to this is, while some methods of abortion unambiguously do destroy the body of the fetus in the process of detaching it from the woman, there are some methods of abortion which don't seem to do this. So these are abortion by pill, by mifepristone and misoprostol, which involve flushing the fetus out of the body, and abortion by hysterotomy, which is essentially a C-section abortion where the fetus is taken out and could, in theory, just be left to die of exposure. This type of abortion is much rarer, but it's still an abortion that happens. And so the thought is, okay, even if this killing versus letting die objection succeeds, it doesn't succeed against all methods of abortion. There are still some methods of abortion which don't involve actively destroying the body of the fetus. And so even if the killing versus letting die objection works against most methods of abortion, it doesn't work against methods of all of them. And so some methods of abortion should still be legal. Now, the way to, I think the way to think about this is, okay, so the way to think about David Boonin's response here is to say, okay, in the methods of abortion which actively involve destroying the body of the fetus, these just involve attacking what we typically take to be the body of the fetus, like the head and the arms and the spine and whatever. Whereas he thinks that these other methods of abortion, the fetus is merely being taken out of the mother's body, which is a distinct body from its own. But I don't think this assumption is obvious, right? Boonin seems to be assuming that the fetus is merely contained within the body of the mother, and that the mother's body, really none of it, none of the mother's body is part of the body of the fetus. And so I think this assumption can be contested. So there's recently been this new literature that sprung up on the metaphysics of pregnancy, which is just about this question. It's about what are the boundaries of the fetus's body. and what are the boundaries of the mother's body in relation to the fetus. So is the fetus merely contained within the body of the mother, or is the fetus part of the mother's body, or is the mother's body part of the fetus, or is some other view true? And although the fetal container view, the view that the fetus is merely contained within the body of the mother, is the intuitive common sense view, and it's the view that almost everyone holds, it's now wildly unpopular in philosophy. There's only one philosopher I'm aware of who still actively holds to this view, and he's Barry Smith. As in somebody who's written on the metaphysics of pregnancy. There are people who haven't published on this issue who have views, but of the people who are contributing to this literature, the only person who still holds this view, I think, is Barry Smith. A co-author of his with a paper that endorsed this fetal container view, I think now no longer endorses the view. So the main rival to the fetal container view is the parthood view, which says there's some kind of parthood relation between the mother and the fetus during pregnancy. Either the fetus is part of the mother, or the mother is part of the fetus. So I'm going to try and defend this parthood view, and then defend the specific version of it that that says that the mother's body, or much of it, for the duration of pregnancy is part of the fetus, and then try to show that this makes trouble for Boonin's argument. So
that seems rather unintuitive on the surface. It seems rather that the first option, the fetal containment view, should be the one we endorse, but I guess I would love to see the way the argument progresses from here.
Yeah, and so I just had this quote brought up. It's by William Lane Craig. I wanted to show that pro-lifers are specifically insistent on endorsing this fetal container view. But if what I argue is right, they should totally reject it and endorse the parthood view, because it helps their view more, and also because the fetal container view is false. That's the primary reason. But yeah. So like William Lane Craig says in this sort of old 2003 apologetics book, the idea that a developing fetus is part of the woman's body is so biologically ignorant that I would call it medieval, except that would be to insult the medievals. The fetus is not like an appendix or a gallbladder. From the moment of its conception and implantation in the wall of the mother's uterus, the fetus is never a part of her body, but is a biologically distinct and complete living being, which is in effect hooked up to the mother as a life support system. So I think that's kind of a representative reaction to the kind of parthood view that I want to put forward. Here's a major problem for the fetal container view. There actually just is no real boundary between the fetus and the rest of the mother's body during pregnancy that isn't imaginary, right? So there's a seamless topological connection between the fetus, the umbilical cord, and the rest of the placenta. And then when it comes to the placenta, as Elsalyn Kingma says, who's the pioneer of the metaphysics of pregnancy literature, the placenta compromises tissues of maternal and fetal origins and grows direct into or out of the uterine wall, just as a tail grows out of a cat. So in our heads, we can imagine that the tail is distinct from the cat, but with a tail on a cat, there's no real boundary between the tail and the cat. They just seamlessly grow into each other. And it turns out the same is true of the fetus in pregnancy. Here's a longer quote, which I think is important to read out in full. I've replaced, you might wonder if you're watching why I've put fetus in square brackets so many times. Essentially, Kingma uses, instead of fetus and mother, the terms foster, essentially meaning fetus, and gravida, meaning the pregnant female organism. And the reason she does this is because fetus and mother are anthropocentric, and she wants to talk about all of mammalian pregnancy, but I've replaced it with fetus and mother because I think it'll be less confusing. So she says, the fetus does not have its own completely connected external boundary that is marked by a physical discontinuity between fetus and gravida. Instead, the fetus is very clearly topologically connected to the mother at the locus of umbilical cord or placenta, just like a tail is to a cat, your testes to your body, or your kidney to the rest of the organism. Second, the amniotic cavity only partially surrounds the fetus, which remains topologically connected via a stalk. Partial surrounding with stalk connection cannot be the sign of tenant niche status. Such morphology is entirely common in mammals. Hearts, lung, kidney, brain, pancreas, intestines, and so on are all suspended in fluid-filled cavities, but connected by a stalk. So with that in mind, it becomes kind of baffling why anyone would think that the fetus is merely contained within the mother's body, as opposed to there being a parthood relation, in the way that a bun is inside the oven or a tub of yogurt is merely contained within a fridge. You might think that there's an obvious reason why there can't be a parthood relation between the mother and the fetus during pregnancy, and that's that the mother and the fetus, unless the mother is gestating a clone of herself, have different genetic codes. And you might think it's a necessary condition of something being a body part of yours that it shares your DNA. And that's a natural intuitive assumption, because basically all of your body parts share your DNA. But it's in fact not a necessary condition on bodily parthood that something shares your DNA. There are lots of counterexamples to this, but the most intuitive one is organ transplants. So I can have an organ transplant from somebody else and it have a completely different genetic code to me, and yet it's still part of me. If somebody were to mutilate a body part that I'd had transplanted from somebody else, even if it had a different genetic code, it would still be physical assault. And the reason would be that it's part of my body, despite it having a different genetic code. So genetic continuity is a good heuristic for judging whether something is a body part of yours, but it's not a necessary condition. Another objection you might have thought of is that the fetus naturally is on a trajectory towards detachment from the mother. And so this means that it can't really be a part, the mother in a way is on a trajectory of detachment from the fetus. And so the mother can't be a part of the fetus. But as Kingma writes, this argument is obviously fallacious. It conflates a possibility with its actualization. The fact that the glass could be broken does not mean it is broken now, nor does the fact that I am mortal make me dead. Similarly, an organ has many parts, such as hair, blood, and kidneys, that can be separated from it. The potential for separate existence does not preclude parthood. Kingma, by the way, takes the opposite parthood view, which says that the fetus is part of the mother. So in a moment, I'll give you a reason to think that maybe it's the other way around, and that for the duration of pregnancy, the mother is part of the fetus. So the reason I think it's more plausible to think that the mother is part of the fetus as opposed to think the fetus is part of the mother is that when you think of a body part, one clue that something is a body part of yours is that it's geared towards promoting your own flourishing. So if something is a body part of yours, it's geared towards doing things that are survival enhancing for you. And for the duration of pregnancy, the mother's body is just geared up in so many ways for enhancing the survival of the fetus. And while there are some ways in which the fetus is geared towards the flourishing and survival of the mother, there are ways in which the fetus makes it the case that the mother's healing responses are faster even after the child is born. The number of ways in which the mother's body is geared towards the flourishing and survival of the fetus are just so many more than the number of ways in which the fetus is geared towards the survival and flourishing of the mother. And so if you just weigh these up, I think it's more plausible to think that the parthood relation runs from fetus to mother as opposed from mother to fetus. So suppose you grant that view, you just grant that part of the conditional, and you say, okay, for the duration of pregnancy, the mother's body, or much of it, is part of the body of the fetus. What does that imply about Boonin's argument? Well, Boonin said that hysterotomy abortions and abortions via pill weren't actively killing the fetus, they were merely unplugging or evicting the fetus. But if you grant this view, then, as I say in the paper, a hysterotomy abortion is not merely the removal of one body from inside another, but the removal of the fetus's body, from its own body, an act of dismemberment. Thus, to prematurely force a fetus out from inside its mother's body is like forcibly evicting a man from his own skin or unplugging him from his brainstem. So if you accept that much of the mother's body is part of the fetus, then there's no real moral distinction between these different methods of abortion. They all involve ripping the fetus from itself. And so the killing versus letting die objection, if you thought that succeeded, still succeeds. And Boonin's argument fails if you grant that the fetus is a person with the right to life. So that is it. I'll just stop sharing my screen.
Yeah, so that was quite interesting. I'm really surprised by the conclusion. It's definitely unusual. But what do you think are the most the worst objections to the view that you just presented to us? It doesn't seem
Yeah,
super intuitive, at least to me, that we should accept this on the face value.
right. Okay, so one objection you might have is just that it's unintuitive. So you might think intuitions are evidence. It really seems like the mother's body isn't part of the fetus. That's really counterintuitive, and so that's a good reason to think that it's not the case. So I do grant that intuitions are evidence, and so the fact that it seems that way to you prima facie is a reason to doubt that it is the case. But there are a few things to say. So one is I wouldn't expect our intuitions about this to be especially reliable because unlike intuitions we have about necessary truths like moral facts and numbers and logic, our intuitions about biology, if they're not informed by the empirical facts, are just unlikely to be truth tracking, right? I'm sure before we cut open the human body, people had all kinds of intuitive seemings about what was going on in there, but I don't think we'd expect those to be especially truth tracking because they're not in touch with the facts. And so I think people's intuitions about pregnancy are largely shaped by the language we use about pregnancy, the cartoony images we use to show the inside of a womb. There's also an extent to which pro-life activism maybe has contaminated our intuitions. Um, so like you'll often see pro-lifers just like displaying images of fetuses or giving out small dolls of fetuses that are just they're just like babies, and there's not there often isn't even a depiction of the womb or the biological situation that it's in, and so you can definitely get this impression that a fetus is just like a pellet contained in a larger object. But when you strip all that away and just look at what pregnancy actually is, it becomes a lot more plausible that our intuitions here wouldn't be truth conducive. Another thing is that intuitions, while they are evidence, they're subject to defeat. So if you have good enough reasons to endorse this model of pregnancy, then you should just doubt the intuitions instead. And so the intuitions can be overridden by the evidence. And I think in this case, whatever model of pregnancy you endorse, intuitions about pregnancy are almost certainly going to turn out to be wrong. And another thing is, at least for me, this is no longer counterintuitive. I think it's often the case that when you kind of sit with a view for a while and really think it through, it what initially seemed counterintuitive is no longer counterintuitive. So those are the three responses. Our intuitions here are likely to be unreliable. Even if they are somewhat reliable, they're subject to defeat, and in this case, they are. And the intuitions can change upon acquaintance with the arguments. So that's one kind of objection you could raise. I have some others if you want to hear some.
Yeah,
Other
for
boys.
sure. Yeah, for sure. You can go ahead and give the other objections, and then I have just a couple questions after that. So
Yeah, perfect. So I'll give you the objection that actually leads me not to endorse this view of pregnancy, which is that I'm a crazy mereological nihilist, so I don't think anything is part of anything.
that was actually something I was gonna ask you later, but oh
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, no, so like I don't think partnerhood is real. I don't think anything has material parts. So I think we can talk freely about my having various body parts, but I think in actuality I don't have any parts. My body is just a collection of small particles arranged body-wise. There's no thing over and above them that's a body. This is true of all material objects and all organisms, including fetuses and including female bodies and male bodies, all bodies, and everything else. Yeah, so on this view, it's not going to turn out to be the case that the mother is part of the fetus or the fetus is part of the mother. Nothing is part of anything. You might think this is wild. It is wild, but it's also true. So, sorry.
Do you think that the view you just described requires some special year composition, something like
It's compatible with hylomorphism. So, the main person to advance the view of pregnancy that I just outlined is a wonderful philosopher called Hilary Yancey. And she's a hylomorphist. She wrote her dissertation just outlining a hylomorphic theory of what it takes to be a body part. And then out of that dissertation, she produced a paper specifically applying that theory to pregnancy. And she showed that she sort of showed that you can plausibly derive this view of pregnancy from her theory. So I think this sits very well with a hylomorphic view of what we are. But I don't think it's committed to that. So for one thing, this kind of view has been endorsed by others who aren't apparently hylomorphists, or at least don't appeal to hylomorphism to make their case. So Alexandria Boyle is a philosopher of biology, who in a conference, I don't think she's published on this yet, but in a conference at the Aristotelian Society, she gave a presentation outlining a very similar view, which also implies that much of the mother's body is part of the fetus, including the maternal heart, kidneys, and lungs. And she didn't appeal to hylomorphism at all. I don't think you need to appeal to a special doctrine of composition. You just need to appeal to a view on which composition happens, right? And that can be any view. That doesn't have to be hylomorphism. Any view on which my phone exists and plants exists could be a view on which the mother's body is part of the fetus.
Yeah, or at least the view that they are living things, and those living things are composites, and basically anything that kind of, as in bag inputs, contributes or kind of messes up in that life, is sort of becomes the part of that thing.
Right. Yeah. So like on organicism, that's a very good option for this kind of view, right? Yeah. So organicism is the view that the only things that exist are very small particles and organisms. And so ordinary objects like tea towels and phones, they don't exist. All that exists are plant, animals, any organisms, and very small particles. So you and I exist, but neither of us are wearing any clothes. When you pick an apple from a tree, it stops existing the moment you take it off because it's no longer part of the organism. You've detached it, and so it becomes an ordinary object and therefore ceases to exist. I think that's a pretty funny view. But yeah, any view on which organisms exist and have parts, you could sustain this view. And even on some hylomorphic views on which organisms don't have parts, you could sustain this view. Some people think that organisms are extended simples. They don't actually have any parts. I think even on this view, you could adopt the view of pregnancy that I've laid out, and I talk about how in the paper.
Yeah, for sure. So, do you think that there are any more plausible views, or that there are any more objections to the view you just presented?
Okay, so you might make an objection to the moral conclusion I tried to derive from the view of pregnancy. So, one thing you might say is, well, look, sure, the mother's body may be part of the fetus's body, but the mother had it first, and so she gets dibs. And the fetus doesn't have any ownership rights over any parts of its own body that were part of the mother's body first and that she still currently owns. And so you might think, okay, this is pretty plausible. In ordinary property cases, if I get something first, I'm the owner of it, it's mine. And if somebody else gets to it just a split second later, it's not theirs, I have it. Tough. And so here's my basic response to that. I'm working with a principle that says essentially, if something is a part of your body, then you have a right to it. And this objector is saying, we need to amend that principle and say, you have a right to something, you have a bodily right to something only if it's a part of your body and it's not currently the body part of someone else who owned it first. And so they're asking us to endorse this much more complicated principle as opposed to my much simpler principle. And so they need a way to motivate rejecting my simpler principle in favor of the more complicated principle, because otherwise, if they're just at a tie, then parsimony wins and my simpler principle goes through. So there are a few ways you can argue for principles in morality. One is to say it's just directly intuitively obvious, but I don't take it that this is like directly intuitively obvious as a principle. It might sound plausible, but it's not just obviously true. And another way to argue for it is to appeal to a normative theory, argue for the normative theory, utilitarianism, Kantianism, virtue ethics, and then try and derive this very long, complicated principle from the theory. But yeah, I think no normative theories imply this complicated principle as opposed to over and above my much simpler principle. I tried having a look to see if various extreme Rothbardian forms of libertarianism might imply this long and complicated principle. I won't go into that now, but like I just don't think they do. And you know, finally, I guess the last way to argue for the principle is to appeal to an intuition about a case that shows that this principle is more plausible than my simpler principle. So here's a case. So the conditions for such a case would have to be one on which two people share a body part, but one person had that body part first, and then the intuition you have to have about the case is the person who glommed on and got the body part later on doesn't have a right to the body part. That needs to be the intuition for this principle to be verified. It's hard to think of a case. The only case I can think of that meets those conditions is one where you're just walking through a forest and somebody takes a special ray gun and beams a conjoined twin onto your body, such that the conjoined twin shares a bunch of your organs. And so in this case, you're supposed to have the intuition, if this principle is true, that it would be permissible for you to saw the conjoined twin off your body because just under anesthetic, because they don't have a right to their body parts because you had them first. But I just don't find this intuitive at all. Like it seems really implausible that you would have a right to cut somebody else off of their own body just because you had the body parts first. It seems like a really unfortunate situation, but it also seems like if somebody has those parts and is dependent upon them as you are, and they really are parts of their body, then they have a bodily right to it just as much as you do.
So yeah, thank you very much for joining me, and thank you for presenting the very novel argument against abortion, or at least a new way to push the abortion discussion in a different direction. And I hope that you will join me in some other future discussions. And for everyone watching, I will meet you in the next video where we will be discussing personal identity with my brand new guest, and you will get to meet him in the next video. So I'll catch you guys later, and goodbye.